Hello, and welcome to the presentation of my design research called Penumbra of Privacy, a people and place-centered approach to privacy for smart workspaces. This was my design thesis for MDes at Carnegie Mellon University from 2021 to 2022. Let me first talk about the word penumbra itself. It's derived from a phenomenon of light, wherein when light falls on an object, it forms a dark shadow called the umbra and a surrounding one, lighter one called the penumbra. The word penumbra has become a metaphor to place an emphasis on concepts that are ambiguous, including those in privacy. I used inspiration from this to push beyond the status quo of current privacy practices. I'm going to talk about my research through 4 different chapters: introduction, listening, discovering, and synthesizing, testing, and finally designing. So let's jump right in. If I'd asked you 20 years ago about what privacy means to you, you'd probably think on similar lines as these children's drawings. It would be about boundaries between self and the others, not being intruded, and somehow related to territoriality. However, privacy in the digital era is so much more complicated than that. It's more about a version of an individual as it's seen through data, and it definitely brings apprehensions and fears along with it. If the last 2 decades have proven anything, the haphazard growth of digital technology has highlighted that there's an imbalance between benefits and risks, and those apprehensions and fears are right to be there. There are always some trade-offs, but this imbalance is caused by the lack of current privacy practices, which is a greater risk. For example, one of the current privacy practices is called notice and consent, which just means that companies have to give you notice of what data points are being collected through cookies. You might have seen these notices where you have to allow or reject cookies, but that doesn't necessarily give a real autonomy to users for decision making, because if they have to use a website, more often than not, they have to just accept the cookies. It's not a meaningful way of exercising choice either. Yet somehow, such privacy practices have set the status quo or umbra of privacy discourse for all emerging technology. One such use case is Internet of Things. Now, Internet of Things is also being used to make buildings smarter. So if you were to ever Google smart buildings, you would see something similar. You would see these dark blue, gray, cold images of buildings seen as computers and a set of data points. There's absolutely no sign of real humans in this. So that begs the question, should we think of privacy for smart buildings in the manner we think about it on personal computers? I argue no, because buildings are not computers. They are places where so much of the human life plays out. So if we were to conceptualize privacy, even while making them smarter, we still need broader social and value-based approaches to complement the data and software narratives that exist today. Secondly, given the fact that this idea of making buildings smarter is in the nascent stages of its development, now is the right time to intervene into the design and development phase of such projects. Which leads me to my research question. How might we actually integrate people-centered and place-centered privacy values in the very design and development phase of creating smart workspaces? There are 2 important parts to this question. The first one is values. What values was I going to talk about here? And in order to identify those values, I leaned on a framework called value-sensitive design by HCI scholars from University of Washington. According to this framework, conceptual investigation, that is the one done through literature review, and empirical investigation, that is the one done through primary research, both of those combined should inform the technical design and development of technology. And this is exactly what I did in the first phase of my research, identifying those values through conceptual and empirical investigation. The second important part of this question is the design and development phase, and which is what I'm going to talk about next. So on a high level, this is the process for any design project. If I were to supplement the design and development process with privacy values, I decided to create a feedback loop by first looking at an actively functioning smart building. The reason to do that was I wanted to be able to access the space as well as the people who inhabit it, as in addition to the people who designed it. This happened to be a project called MITES at CMU, tagged as an ultra-robust IoT platform. I investigated the project through silent observations, followed by 7 one-on-one interviews, which also included a design probe. I then used all my learnings through my observations and those interviews to synthesize privacy values so that I could embed them in the design and development phase. The hope was that it would create something that is preventive and not remedial, so that privacy doesn't need to be fixed after the fact. This process also made sure that I was creating something contextual, which also happens to be one of the values that I created. How did I create these privacy values? So I leaned on three different things. One, insights from my interviews and design probes. Second, things that I was learning from published research. And third, my own position as a value-sensitive designer. Let me give you an example. If you think about the idea of privacy in the physical realm, there's one common notion that you should expect the least amount of privacy when you're in public spaces, like a bus or a public park or streets. But the more you are in private spaces, like your home or even your own room, that is where you can expect the most amount of privacy. On the surface, it seems right, but a co-working space like the one I was studying is neither fully public nor is it fully private. And the reason for that is that it has public and private areas with respect to each other. So we need a different interpretation of privacy here. So for example, a corridor is a more public space, but it's less public as compared to the street. It's more private in that sense. Now, I kept hearing this interesting example when it comes to having sensitive conversation. During my interviews, most people mentioned that the greater the sensitivity of the conversation, whether it was about family or friends, relationships, money, or anything like that, they would move from more private areas of the building to the least private areas and even on the street. The reason for doing that was they were trying to get anonymity in the crowd and sometimes also to prevent the microphones in the building from recording and keeping a record of that data. Now, this highlights a very interesting tension between the privacy norms that we are used to thinking about and the actual behavior that people have in this space. So then, what would it mean to have a value called differentiation? That is, how might we distinguish between data practices for public versus private areas of the same building? So this was one of the values that I created along with its definition on the right side. And I used a similar process to create many other values under three buckets. One was human-centered, the second was place-centered, and third were data-centered. Place-centered was speaking to the physical aspect of the building as well as the relationships that play out in these buildings. So for example, adaptation, wherein if you have a desk, each person adapts the same desk in a very different manner to reflect themselves. And that also forms a different kind of culture. A lab that is design oriented could be very different from a lab that is biomedical oriented, for example. Now, these three buckets were interesting as values, but I wanted to test how these would play out, which brings me to the third chapter of testing. So once I had these refined values, I decided to conduct a workshop with 6 participants. These 6 participants were privacy engineers. And I walked them through a step-by-step process of coming up with ideas for a smart building. And in that process, I scaffolded them by talking about needs first, and then talking about ideation based on those needs, stakeholders involved in that ideation, as well as the privacy values that they would want to keep in mind. They spent 65 minutes on ideation, followed by 20 minutes of open-ended group conversation and 5 minutes for individual feedback form. I was actually less interested in what they came up with as a final idea, but more interested in that conversation and their reflection on the process. So the conversation that unfolded revealed 4 key insights. The first was that there was a mixed opinions on being given a menu of values. Remember, I had spoken about 3 buckets where I had created values, but I also made sure to give some blank cards to my participants so that they could fill out any other privacy values that they thought were relevant. Now, there was a mixed opinion on this. While some felt that it was tricky to pick from a predetermined set of values, others felt that it was good to have a mix of open and predetermined because it opened up their mind to new ideas in terms of privacy that they would have otherwise not thought of. The second one was seeing data from a different perspective. So because my audience was privacy engineers, they look at data from a more technical perspective and less human-centered perspective. but they felt that this process gave them a more people-centered perspective to thinking about data. And one participant said that, it has actually helped me think about how people would use the building on a day-to-day basis. And it felt like it was a different perspective to how I think about data collection. The third one was values help think beyond software. As the discussion proceeded, the participants mentioned that this process enabled them to think of privacy more broadly instead of something that needs to be fixed through just a software. The same participant, who found it tricky to choose values early on, was inspired by the effectiveness and simplicity of this value called the barriers. They mentioned that it'll definitely be good to consider barriers in future design rather than small software guarantees that we are used to. And this led to another conversation around what would it mean to design something like a laptop webcam cover for a building, or what does it mean to pull a plug when you need to disconnect? And leads me to the final final insight for pessimism for technology. This really stuck with me and made me empathize with my participants because as privacy engineers, these individuals are constantly working to fix what has either already gone wrong or could potentially go wrong. And that makes them feel pessimistic about technology. So this particular participant said that I feel like I'm always trying to stop bad things from happening instead of thinking about what if we actually created something that isn't going to do bad things. They mentioned that it was refreshing for them to think about the front end of the design and development in a manner that integrates needs as well as values right from the start. So these four insights told me two things. One, that it was definitely worth bringing broader perspective to privacy. And second was that despite that fact, it was difficult to approach the values in the current format that I had given them to my participants. Which brings me to chapter 4 of design, making values tangible, accessible, and more structured. So on the left is how I had presented values, but in order to make them more tangible, I created a structure where each value was presented through a commonly relatable metaphor. And then I complemented that with the same prompt that I had for IoT. So this structure looks like this, which is for barriers, there's an image of an open door. And what would it mean to shut that door to temporarily disconnect yourself? Similarly, all the values that I had took the form of these cards with an image. And my favorite is probably perceptibility with a Waldo in it. And just like that, I had a deck of 14 cards. I saw these cards as design probes for interdisciplinary teams, or multidisciplinary teams rather, working on smart building projects. So they could mean anyone from building owners and managers who use these applications, IT or IoT engineers who design the hardware and software, architects who integrate this into the building, and designers who help to create interfaces for these, and hopefully also privacy consultants. While these design probes were interesting, I also realized that there was a need to create a structured way to be able to use them. So I went back to the values and the definitions that I had and created principles with respect to those values. And while creating those principles, I also kept in mind that these principles could be relevant to different phases of a project or of a design and development process. So the yellow became conceptualization, which is very early on when ideation is happening. The blue is the detailing, when there is early on conceptualization, but you're detailing the finer details of the hardware, software, as well as anything else that it impacts. The final one was refining, which was something that could serve as guardrails throughout the process. As an example, look at number 4. Assess and evaluate to find the right balance between intent and impact. Now, there are 2 values under it, equilibrium and foresight. Equilibrium speaks about the balance between the benefits and the risks that I showed you early on in the presentation. And foresight talks about that it should be important to consider the impact of the system on users as well as society over a period of time. So for example, what does it mean to normalize this kind of data collection? I mean, we are probably getting used to it as well as annoyed by it on our phones, but what would it mean to do it at the scale of each space in a building? Once I had these, my cards also started getting refined because they corresponded to a specific part of the specific phase of the design and development process. So barriers, which was initially black, was a part of the refining phase of the detailing phase of the process. I used these cards and then created a toolkit, a privacy design toolkit for shared smart workspaces. The toolkit included detailed instructions, who should participate, how can someone prepare, who should be facilitating, as well as cards and space for ideation by either individual or team members. So on the left, you see the principle as well as the cards and space to write, draw, or describe ideas with respect to that. The hope was that at the end of it, the team could come together to form a design brief that they would all uphold as privacy sensitive design project that they were working on. This could be relevant for creators like IoT engineers, privacy engineers, architects, as well as designers who work on smart building ideas. Even though I created a toolkit, I hope that someday this could be accessible online through a platform. Making it accessible online through a platform would enable many different things. One of which is give a community for people to talk about different ideas, or download resources like the toolkit and others as it evolves through download resources. But my favorite probably is the one about engaging the team. What would it mean to integrate something like Miro into this platform? So for example, perceptibility that I spoke about earlier to bring awareness to the hidden or the less obvious presence of data sensing. Different members of an interdisciplinary team could come up with different ideas for it. So for example, a designer could say, hey, I will put up an effective notice in the space to inform occupants. A technical person or an engineer would say, what if I designed an app or a system to give a notification when anyone is in the vicinity of sensors? An architect could say, it could be simplified by just placing sensors at an eye level. So each value can be dealt with in through many different ideas. But once those ideas are in, it's up to the team to decide which ones they want to uphold so that those ideas and values serve as guardrails and a design brief that they work towards. The hope is that they will uphold these values throughout the project and integrate them throughout the design and development phase so that the end outcome is more privacy sensitive. This is the extent of the project that I was able to do. If I were to have next steps, I would want to design the platform, test parts of the platform, and find the right stakeholder who would facilitate such activities. If I had more time, I would love to develop a game or a simulation that highlights the trade-offs between privacy values and the long-term repercussions of data collection. I have some early ideas, but it needs a lot of refinement. That's it for today on this project. Thank you for listening. If you have any ideas or would want to collaborate, please feel free to email me.